What exactly is faith? Well, many people define faith as belief without evidence, because Hebrews 11:1 says that faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. But I'm going to show you why faith is not belief without evidence, and I'll explain what this verse is actually saying. So in this episode, we'll look at what faith is and what it's not. Hi, my name is David Cipriano. I am a youth pastor, and here on this channel, we're all about learning the Bible and its principles. We cover topics such as theology, apologetics, and Christian living. And in this video, we're going to talk about faith and how it's defined and described in the Bible. And I think that this topic is really important because faith is often misunderstood and misrepresented, but it's so essential that we get it because of how important it is in our lives. And I want for everybody here listening to realize something, and it's that everybody has faith, whether they're a Christian, an atheist, a believer, a non-believer. Everybody and every type of person has faith. You know, faith is often seen as a religious thing or a Christian thing, but that couldn't be further from the truth. And hopefully this episode is going to help us with some misconceptions about faith so that all of us can have a better understanding of it. So first of all, I want to talk about what faith is not. And let me just say that faith is not belief without evidence or belief in spite of the evidence. And skeptics often use this definition of faith, that it's belief without evidence, as a way to attack Christianity. And this would work because if something goes contrary to the evidence, then that makes it not true. Maybe you've heard a person say that they're not religious, they don't have faith, they just believe in evidence, or they just believe in science. And on one hand, I think that this type of statement is wrong because Christian beliefs and the Bible don't actually go against the evidence. But even besides that, that is still not what faith is. Faith is not belief without evidence. Now, when a person describes faith this way, they'll often point to Hebrews 11:1, which says, "Now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen." And so it's often stated that these things not seen mean that they don't have evidence or any type of proof. But really, things not seen doesn't mean things that aren't real or things that don't have evidence, because there's a lot of things that can't be seen, but we still have evidence of them. For example, think about gravity. You cannot see gravity. Gravity doesn't have a color. You can't reach out and grab it. It is not some physical object, and yet we have evidence of it. It is a very real thing. Or also think about love. Love isn't physical. It doesn't have a size or a weight. It is not something tangible, and yet we would all agree, hopefully, that love is real. Or think about radio waves or Wi-Fi signals. You can't see them, you can't reach out and grab them, and yet they're real. We could give a few other examples, such as air, emotions, your conscience, but I think that we can all understand that just because something can't be seen or physically touched, it can still be real. Just because it's not visible or tangible doesn't mean that it doesn't have evidence. And so whenever the Bible says that faith is the evidence of things not seen, this things not seen does not mean a lack of evidence, but rather not seen yet, meaning that it's something to be fulfilled in the future. And we'll talk more about that later. And maybe you don't realize it yet, but we have faith in all sorts of future events based on evidence, where we haven't seen them happen yet, and yet the evidence shows that it's true. For example, I have faith that the sun will set tonight. Now, I haven't seen the sun set tonight yet, and yet because of all the evidence of the past, I believe that it's going to happen again this evening. I have faith that the sun is going to rise tomorrow, not because I've already seen it, not because I have scientific proof that it has to happen tomorrow, but because this is what has always happened and the evidence leads me to that conclusion. Or another example, think about how seeds grow into plants. Now, you might not have the exact proof that that thing has already happened yet, but you can point to the evidence and say that this will happen. I don't have proof that gravity will continue working tomorrow, and yet the evidence leads me to that conclusion. Everybody who has ever sat on a chair had faith in that chair that it would support their weight. And this wasn't a belief that was contrary to evidence. It was belief that was held because of the evidence. You see, none of those examples are contrary to evidence. They go along with it. And even though these types of things haven't been seen yet, it's not in spite of evidence or contrary to evidence. And similarly, faith is not belief that goes against evidence or that is held in spite of it. Now, unfortunately, many Christians will agree with the statement that faith is belief without evidence, and they'll say that we have to have faith in God and in the Bible. And yeah, they're right on that one part, but really they're wrong about the definition of faith, because if you think that faith is belief without evidence, then you are stating that you are gullible and you will believe anything. Because think about it, if evidence isn't required, then why are you not an atheist? Why aren't you a Muslim? Why are you a Buddhist? Because after all, if faith doesn't need evidence, then why not have faith in anything and everything? And so if a person believes that faith is belief without evidence, and they claim to have faith, then they are undermining the great evidence that Christianity has, and they are exposing themselves for being gullible. You see, I am a Christian not without evidence for my beliefs, and not in spite of evidence that would go contrary to my beliefs, but I'm a Christian because of the evidence. The evidence doesn't go against Christianity, it supports it. And whenever we look at the Bible, we see that God does not call people to a blind faith. He never tells people to believe without having any kind of evidence or proof. And I want to show you a couple of Bible stories that demonstrate this. One of these comes in Exodus chapter 9, and it says in verses 13 and 14, "And the Lord said unto Moses, Rise up early in the morning, and stand before Pharaoh, and say unto him, Thus saith the Lord God of the Hebrews, Let my people go, that they may serve me. For I will at this time send all my plagues upon thine heart, and upon thy servants, and upon thy people, that thou mayest know that there is none like me in all the earth." And so there is a claim being made here that there is none like God in all the earth. And this claim was to be believed by everybody, but it wasn't to be believed blindly, not just because Moses said so, not just because the Israelites had traditionally believed it. No, God is going to show evidence to give reason for this belief. God is not just telling the Egyptians or Pharaoh to believe, he's showing them why they should believe. He's going to provide them evidence. And the evidence that's going to be given here is the 10 plagues. And so, as we can see here, God commands faith, not in spite of evidence or without evidence, but because of the evidence. Because faith is not belief without evidence. Another example that we can see comes in the New Testament with Jesus, and it comes in Luke 5, and this is a story where people bring a man who had palsy on a bed to Jesus, and it says that they could not find by what way they might bring him in because of the multitude. They went upon the housetop and let him down through the tiling with his couch into the midst before Jesus. So these men go out of their way, they make a huge scene, and they bring their crippled friend to Jesus, and here's Jesus' response. And when he saw their faith, he said unto him, Man, thy sins are forgiven thee. And the scribes and the Pharisees began to reason, saying, Who is this which speaketh blasphemies? Who can forgive sins but God alone? And so as we see throughout these verses, Jesus declared this man's sins to be forgiven. And the scribes and Pharisees had a problem with that because they knew, rightfully, that only God could forgive sins. And whenever Jesus claimed that this man's sins were forgiven, then Jesus was claiming to be God. And so Jesus doubles down on this, and he calls them to believe by giving them some evidence. So in verse 22, we pick up reading again. It says, "But when Jesus perceived their thoughts, he answering said unto them, What reason ye in your hearts? Whether is easier to say, Thy sins be forgiven thee, or to say, Rise up and walk? But that ye may know that the Son of Man hath power upon earth to forgive sins, he said unto the sick of the palsy, I say unto thee, Arise, take up thy couch, and go into thine house. And immediately he rose up before them, and took up that whereon he lay, and departed to his own house, glorifying God. And they were all amazed, and they glorified God, and were filled with fear, saying, We have seen strange things today." So Jesus calls them to belief. He is commanding them to believe that he is God and that he is the promised Messiah. But he doesn't just tell them, just trust me. He doesn't say, just believe. He doesn't say, have faith without demanding evidence. No, whenever Jesus wants them to believe him, he provides evidence so that they will. Because Jesus knew that faith is not just gullibility. It is not just believing everything that you hear. No, you need to have a good reason for why you believe what you believe. And because of that, Jesus provided evidential proof that he was who he said he was. When Jesus claimed to be God and forgive sins, he performed the miracle by telling that man to take up his couch and walk. And so Jesus provided proof that went along with his claim. And people had faith not just because, not without a good reason, but because Jesus proved it. Faith is not belief without evidence. And there's a lot of other examples in the Bible that we could point to where God isn't calling for a blind faith, but providing evidence to give reason for faith. For example, we could look at Elijah versus the prophets of Baal. We could see the signs that God showed to Gideon and to Moses. We could talk about how whenever God promised Hezekiah an extra 15 years, God made the sun's shadow to move backwards. Whenever Jesus claimed to be the Messiah, he pointed to the scriptures. He pointed to John the Baptist's words. He proved these claims through his miracles. And so faith isn't belief without evidence, and this is a really bad way to describe it. If faith was belief without evidence, we shouldn't have it, because we should believe things that are true and logical. The next thing that faith is not, and this really goes along with the last statement, is that faith is not being gullible. And the Bible actually condemns gullibility. We look at Proverbs 14:15, and it says, The simple believeth every word, but the prudent man looketh well to his going. And in the Bible, simple doesn't just mean plain. It rather has the idea of ignorant or dumb. And so a dumb person is going to believe every word. They don't question things. They're not skeptical. They just believe whatever they hear. But the prudent man, or a wise man, they look well to their going, meaning that they ask questions. They can have doubts sometimes. They don't just blindly believe. They're not gullible. And so this is a biblical principle to not believe everything that you hear. We are not to just trust people blindly. We shouldn't just naively accept everything that people say, whether you get your information from the news or from social media or from your friends or family. Even at church or in other spiritual settings, we shouldn't just blindly believe everything that we hear. In my time debating the Bible online, whenever I encounter Mormons, I've noticed that they often appeal to faith whenever they're in a debate. These are the moments whenever they're confronted by the evidence and by the actual facts rather than whatever their church is teaching them. And often whenever they're in a really bad position in the argument, they'll just appeal to faith. They'll say, ask God to show you that something is true. They'll appeal to these burnings in their bosoms that they feel. They'll just say, have faith. You see, they know that they don't have evidence or facts backing them up, and so they make this appeal to faith, which is really just gullibility, but that is not what faith should be. And the Bible tells us a lot about how to identify false teachings, false prophets. It warns us against being gullible and believing everything that we hear. And here's a couple of passages that go along with that. In Deuteronomy 18, it says, "And if thou say in thine heart, how shall we know the word which the Lord hath not spoken?" In other words, how can we identify a false message or a false teaching? In verse 22, it says, "When a prophet speaketh in the name of the Lord, if the thing follow not, nor come to pass, that is the thing which the Lord hath not spoken, but the prophet hath spoken it presumptuously, thou shalt not be afraid of him." So the principle that we have in the Bible is that whenever there is a prophet and they are making claims under the name of God, we shouldn't just blindly accept it. No, we should test their statements to see if they're true. For example, if they make a prediction, like let's say if somebody says Jesus is coming back in 2026, well, if the year 2026 has come and gone and Jesus didn't come back, then you know that that prophet is false. You shouldn't pay attention to them. You shouldn't believe them. They're a false prophet. Don't be gullible. Here's another example that the Bible gives us. In Acts 17:11, it's talking about the church in Berea who heard the message being preached from Paul and Silas, and it says about them, "These were more noble than those in Thessalonica, in that they received the word with all readiness of mind, and searched the scriptures daily, whether those things were so." And so even whenever people were hearing messages from apostles like the Apostle Paul, they still didn't just blindly believe it. They were questioning and they were skeptical of the Apostle Paul. And this habit that they had was encouraged. These people were more noble. And so wherever you are, and no matter who you're listening to, don't be gullible. And this doesn't mean that we should be so skeptical that we never believe anything. No, we shouldn't be like that. But we shouldn't have a faith that is just gullibility, because that's not really what faith is. Next thing I want to show you that faith is not exclusive to Christianity. So earlier we talked about how people often claim something like, "I'm not religious, I don't have faith, I just believe in evidence," or "I just believe in science." And the problem with that statement is that that person actually does have faith. They may not have a Christian faith or a religious faith, but really every single religion and every single belief system and every single worldview requires faith. And so no matter who you are or what you believe, you do have faith, whether or not you realize it. And there are some people out there who say that they just don't believe in anything, but that's not really true. They do believe in some things, but even at that person still has faith that religious views aren't true. So really, it's literally impossible to not have faith in anything. Everybody has it. And so whenever people say that they don't have any faith, I like to challenge them with what they believe about the creation of the universe. And whether your belief comes from a scientist or from a school teacher or from a science book or curriculum, whether your belief comes from the Bible, or even if it's just your own idea, you still have faith in whatever you believe. And even if you believe that the earth was never created and that it's always been here, that is faith too. These are all beliefs and they are all faith, because none of these theories have been scientifically proven. And Hebrews 11:3 admits that. It says, "Through faith, we understand that the worlds were framed by the word of God, so that things which are seen were not made of things which do appear." And so as a Christian, I don't have any problem with admitting that yes, it takes faith to believe what the Bible says. It takes faith to accept the teachings of Christianity. It takes faith to believe in God, in Jesus. But Christians are not the only ones who have faith, because it also takes faith to believe in atheism. It would take faith to accept the Big Bang Theory. It takes faith to believe in evolution. And here's what I believe. I believe that what the Bible says is backed up by more evidence than the idea of the Big Bang without a creator. I mean, both of these worldviews require faith, but really it takes more faith to be an atheist than a Christian. Personally, I could not accept that the entire universe was all condensed down into a tiny little speck, but then out of nowhere, for no reason, it just exploded, and it just so happened to create a finely tuned universe. I do not have that much faith. It is way easier for me to believe the Bible because the Bible's claims are a lot more logical. I mean, think about it this way. If you were walking along the beach and you saw this really elaborate sandcastle, you would know that somebody designed it. You wouldn't think that it just happened because the wind blew it that way. You wouldn't think that it fell out of the sky or something like that. No, you would know that somebody intentionally designed it that way. You would know that it had a creator. And if you claim that the wind blew it that way, or it just so happened randomly, nobody would believe you, and people would think that you were crazy. And if something like that is crazy to believe in, imagine how much more crazy and more ridiculous it is to believe this type of thing about the universe. I mean, these people who claim to believe in evidence and science rather than believing the Bible or Christianity, they have way more faith than we have. It makes a lot more sense to say that a divine creator created the universe and designed it than it does to say that nobody created it. It just essentially popped into existence. And so we've talked about what faith is not. It's not belief without evidence, it's not being gullible, and it's not exclusive to Christianity. And so with all of that being said, I now want to talk about what faith is. First of all, faith is believing in what you can't see. So going back to Hebrews 11:1, where we find this definition of faith, or as some might call it, a description rather than a definition, but it says, "Now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen." So faith is believing in what you can't see. And with this, I think about the example of Thomas, or as many of us refer to him as Doubting Thomas, because Thomas famously doubted the resurrection. In spite of following Jesus around for years, and in spite of seeing all of the miracles that he didn't believe that Jesus would rise again from the grave after 3 days. And here's what it says in John 20:25. "The other disciples therefore said unto him, We have seen the Lord. But he said unto them, Except I shall see in his hands the print of the nails, and put my finger into the print of the nails, and thrust my hand into his side, I will not believe." And so Thomas was very dogmatic about it. He would not believe that Jesus really rose from the dead, even with Jesus' claims before his death, even after hearing the disciples say that they had seen the Lord. He wouldn't believe it himself until he saw it with his own eyes and felt the resurrected body with his hand. But then 8 days later, Jesus appears to Thomas. And it says, starting in verse 27, "Then saith he to Thomas, Reach hither thy finger, and behold my hands, and reach hither thy hand, and thrust it into my side, and be not faithless, but believing. And Thomas answered and said unto him, My Lord and my God." This was the moment when Thomas finally believed in the resurrection, because he had seen it with his eyes and he had experienced it physically. But then Jesus confronts him with this in verse 29, and I think that all of us should really take it to heart. It says, "Jesus saith unto him, Thomas, because thou hast seen me, thou hast believed. Blessed are they that have not seen and yet have believed." You see, Thomas had belief, but he didn't have faith. And Jesus wasn't suggesting that Thomas should have faith without evidence, but rather that he should have faith before visibly seeing. Jesus had already given Thomas so much evidence before. He had given Thomas so many reasons to believe in the resurrection. And Thomas should have used that evidence to trust in Jesus' promise to resurrect. Thomas believed, but he didn't really have faith, because faith is believing what you can't see. For most people, seeing is believing, but for Christians, believing is seeing. Here's what Peter says in 1 Peter 1:8, "Whom having not seen ye love, in whom though now ye see him not, yet believing, ye rejoice with joy unspeakable and full of glory." And so even though we don't visibly see Jesus right now, we love him, we believe in him, and we rejoice because of him. Faith is believing in what you can't see. Next is that faith is trusting in the fulfillment of a promise. And in the Christian sense, faith is trusting God to keep his word. Faith is the present conviction of a future reality. So going back again to Hebrews 11:1, it says that faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. And again, these things not seen are not things that aren't real or things that don't have evidence. It's rather things that haven't been fulfilled yet, but you're trusting in them. And so if we continue reading through Hebrews 11, where this definition of faith is, you'll see that it's not believing without evidence. It's not believing in things that aren't real. It's rather believing in the fulfillment of a promise. And this chapter is called the Hall of Faith because it gives many examples of people who demonstrated great faith, such as Abel, who offered a better sacrifice, trusting God's approval. We see Noah, who built an ark because he trusted God's warning of the flood. We read about Abraham, who left his home, trusting that God would give him new land and guide him to it. Abraham also was about to sacrifice his own son Isaac because he trusted God's promise. We see about Sarah, who believed in faith that God would give her a son in spite of her old age. We see Moses, who left Egypt because he was trusting in God's greater reward. And we read about the Israelites who crossed the Red Sea because they had faith in God's power. From all of these examples, it's very clear that faith is backed by evidence, and faith is trusting that God will fulfill his promises in the future. And one of the ways that we can have this type of faith in future events is because of past events. I like the example of David, how he shows this whenever he's about to fight Goliath, because this was an impossible battle. People didn't believe that he could do this. King Saul didn't believe in him. But here's what he says in 1 Samuel 17:37. David said, "Moreover, the Lord that delivered me out of the paw of the lion and out of the paw of the bear, he will deliver me out of the hand of this Philistine." And Saul said unto David, "Go, and the Lord be with thee." David had faith that God would help him defeat Goliath because God had already delivered him from a lion and from a bear. David had faith for the future because he had seen how God had provided in the past. And similarly, whenever we look at the Hebrews 11 Hall of Faith, those people who had faith in God didn't have it for no good reason. They didn't just trust without evidence. No, they had faith for the future in God because of what God had already done in the past. So faith is trusting in the fulfillment of a promise. Next thing that faith is, number 3, is that it's the opposite of doubt. In other words, belief is the opposite of disbelief. 2 Timothy 1:7, Paul writes, "For God hath not given us the spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind." God doesn't want for you to be living in fear. If you have a worried, anxious heart, know that that didn't come from God. No, God doesn't want you to be living in fear or in worry or in anxiety. He wants you to have power and love and a sound mind. And so God calls us to faith, and he commands us to not be living in doubt. What you fear the most reveals where you trust God the least. So I would encourage you as a listener to consider to yourself right now, what is it that you're the most afraid of? You know, as humans, we fear all types of things. We fear rejection. We have the fear of missing out. We can be afraid of failure or the unknown. You might be worried right now about a health situation or a financial concern. Maybe you're scared about your future. You don't know where your life is going to go. Maybe there's some type of family situation that you're dealing with. Maybe you're really worried about some spiritual matter, such as the assurance of your salvation. Maybe you're scared about your eternal security. Maybe you're having trouble trusting the Bible. Maybe you're doubting God's love. But hear this, what you fear the most reveals where you trust God the least. Proverbs 3:5 tells us, "Trust in the Lord with all thine heart, and lean not into thine own understanding." So whatever you worry about the most shows where you're not trusting in the Lord with all of your heart. Instead, you're leaning on your own understanding. And so faith is the opposite of doubt. I love what Jesus said in Mark chapter 5 to Jairus. Jairus was a man who had a little daughter, and she was lying at the point of death, and he had come to Jesus in his desperation so that Jesus could heal her. And it says in verse 35 that while he yet spake, there came from the ruler of the synagogue's house certain which said, "Thy daughter is dead. Why troublest thou the master any further?" As soon as Jesus heard the word that was spoken, he saith unto the ruler of the synagogue, "Be not afraid, only believe." Hey, I think that those are good words for us to apply to our lives. Be not afraid, only believe. Stop living in your fears. Stop focusing on all of these worst case scenarios and these what ifs, and just have faith in God. Trust that God will do tomorrow what he's been doing throughout your whole life. Have faith that God is going to keep his promises, and not for no reason, not just because I said so, but because God has been proving himself already. And so we can use the evidence that we already have and use that for faith to trust for the future. And then the last thing I want to say about faith is that faith is required for pleasing God. So looking back again at Hebrews chapter 11, the Bible talks about Enoch, and it says that by faith, Enoch was translated that he should not see death and was not found because God had translated him. For before his translation, he had this testimony that he pleased God. So Enoch was a very unique man in the sense that he never died. He didn't die because God took him. Enoch was a man who pleased God. And then it says this in the very next verse, "But without faith it is impossible to please him. For he that cometh to God must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of them that diligently seek him." You see, Enoch had that testimony and that experience of translation because he had faith and he pleased God. And you should know that pleasing God without faith is not difficult. It's not hard. No, it's impossible. And so a person who doesn't have faith and a person who lacks trust in God is displeasing to him. And hopefully we can all say that we want to please God. We want to live our lives for him. We want to obey him and follow him. And if we're going to do that, we'll have to have faith. We're going to have to trust him even whenever we can't see it yet. We're going to have confidence that God is going to keep his promises. And you need to decide, stop living in fear and start living in faith. Faith is not belief without evidence. Faith isn't being gullible, and it's not exclusive to Christians. No, faith is believing in what you can't see. It is trusting in the fulfillment of a promise. Faith is the opposite of doubt, and it is absolutely essential if you're going to please God. Well, if this episode was a help to you, if you could do me a favor by clicking the like button so that this video will get pushed to more people. Also, make sure to subscribe so that you don't miss out on future episodes. And with all that being said, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next episode.